Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of Folio 116 verso of the Voynich Manuscript. As you probably know, the Voynich is entirely written in an unknown script, but it also contains a handful of inscriptions in regular 15th century handwriting. Of those, the one on the last page of the manuscript, Folio 116v, is the largest and most well known. I really recommend watching the previous video first if you haven't already. When I first learned about the Voynich manuscript, this was one of the things I found the most fascinating about it. Marginalia are common, innocent features of medieval manuscripts. Can be commentaries or unrelated notes left there by the scribes or any later owners or readers, usually very concrete, down to earth, to the point. But in the world's most mysterious manuscript, the marginalia are also mysterious. It's almost creepy because we should be able to understand this, but we can't. It's recognizable, but only at first glance, making it in a way more liminal and enchanting than the manuscript itself. If you watch the first video, you'll understand that there's no quick solution to this text. This piece of parchment that would fit in the palm of your hand has been scrutinized by more minds than any other in the world, and yet there's something that's been missing from all analysis so far: genre. What kinds of text can we expect on the last page of manuscripts? If the middle lines are really a charm, what can we expect of charms? I knew honestly nothing about this before I started researching this video a couple of months ago, so I decided to find some people who do. On the general subject of marginal inscriptions in medieval manuscripts, there's one name that comes to mind right away, and that is Professor Erik Kwakkel. So I decided to ask him for his impressions of Folio 116v. He answers that inscriptions on flyleaves and paste downs often concern provenance details, who owned the manuscript, personal notes of the owner, for example, I owe this much to that person, or a quote from a text that spoke to the owner, so it can basically be anything, or pen trials. He then says that the inscription seems too substantial for a pen trial. So that's one bit of information for us. The man who knows everything about pen trials says that it's not a pen trial. There goes one of my favorite earlier hypotheses. On to charms then. The next person I contacted was Dr. Don Schemer, author of Binding Words, Textual Amulets in the Middle Ages. He said that the annotations in Latin script on Folio 116v do indeed resemble a charm, but it's neither a complete charm nor one he had seen before. Yeah, I know. Okay, but maybe, what if I need to ask someone specialized in German charms specifically? How about Dr. Marco Heiles, principal investigator of the research project Magical Written Artifacts in Late Medieval German Instructional Literature at the University of Hamburg? He's literally leading a research project on charms in the language and period we're interested in. He basically confirmed everything we suspected. The lines with crosses do look like a charm. The surrounding text does look German. But there are still a lot of questions and no direct answers. He then asked if he could pass on my message to the, here we go again, Netzwerk Historische Wissens- und Gebrauchsliteratur, a group of scholars interested in exactly the kinds of materials we seem to be dealing with in the German parts of the inscription. And they couldn't help me either. One day while running, I was listening to an episode of the Medieval podcast with Daniel Cybulski. It was an interview with Katherine Hindly.
When you're looking at a charm, what kind of phrasing are they using often when you see one of these so that you recognize it as this is something that somebody needs to say or write somewhere in order to make something happen?
The first thing that I would generally spot is not even phrasing, it's crosses between the words. Mm-hmm. So that's not every charm by any means, but if you open a page and you have a little sentence with a cross between every word in the type of book that's likely to include a charm, that's often going to be one.
She clearly knows a lot about charms, so I asked her if she'd be interested in talking to me about a charm in the Voynich manuscript, and she was. Hello everyone, I'm here with Associate Professor of Medieval Literature, Katherine Hindly, whose interests include manuscript studies and the history of medicine. That alone makes her an excellent conversation partner for a chat about the Voynich Manuscript. But the reason why I really wanted to invite Katherine for this episode is the book she published in 2023. It's called Textual Magic, and it's all about the medieval belief in the effects of charms and similar practices. Katherine, thank you so much for doing this interview with me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
When I first contact a scholar by email, I'm not always sure how to handle the whole Voynich situation. Many of them have been approached by crazy people before. Do I just assume that everyone in the whole world knows about it, or do I need to introduce it? But with you, I was in luck because you had first-hand experience with the manuscript.
Yeah, I did my PhD at Yale, and I ended up co-teaching a course on magic, science, and medicine in medieval Europe with Agnieszka Recht, who's now the curator at the Voynich, in charge of the Voynich, I think. Yeah, as part of that class, we got the manuscript out to have the students think about not so much about the Voynich itself, but about what you can tell from a manuscript, even when you can't read it. Because with undergraduates, they haven't done paleography. They're not, they don't necessarily have Latin or the medieval languages. And so being able to talk about materiality and like looking at the pictures and what can you see from the kind of type of decoration, the type of construction of the book. And then the Voynich was just a kind of extra surprise. So every so often as we were talking, the students would start to realize like, oh my God, we know what that is.
Now, before we get to the Voynich marginalia specifically, because we're going to talk about the charm-like inscription there, I'd like to ask you some questions about charms in general. Starting off with the most obvious, though perhaps not the most easy question. What is a charm?
Yes, not the easiest question. I was interested in verbal charms specifically. So I think there's probably a broader definition. But in my work, I was looking at places where people use either spoken or written languages to try to create a physical change in the world. So not that you're trying to persuade somebody like emotionally or convince them of something, but that you're saying, if you say these words, you will stop bleeding, your fever will end, whatever it might be. And that obviously kind of bleeds into prayer. As I was trying to collect as many charms as I could, I was looking at how the manuscript treats the charm. And so something that was purely devotional and didn't have an associated practical outcome, I was leaving to the side. But I think there really is a kind of spectrum of what somebody would think of as being a prayer and what somebody would think of as being a charm. And although there was some condemnation of charms as superstition, most of the ones that survive are actually very Christian in nature. There are exceptions, but most of them really, I think that people wouldn't think they were doing anything unorthodox at all. The vast majority of things that I've seen are medical or protective in nature. And then there are a couple that are more practical, like there's one to catch a fish, there's one to make somebody fall in love with you, there's one to like stop a baby from crying.
Do you think everyone in medieval Europe would have been familiar with charms, or was this really like kind of a marginal thing that you only find hidden here and there?
I think they were everywhere. Certainly they would have circulated orally. For my book, I think I ended up with 1,100, and that's from like a year of archival research. There's so many of them. We know that a lot of the ones that were used in the Middle Ages survived into the 20th century in England, even though the Reformation kind of tried to squash them a bit. Yeah, I mean, I sort of think of them as I would think of nursery rhymes today. Like maybe not everybody knows all of them, but people know the concept and the familiar ones. I mean, they're in academic medicine as well. They tend to be described as practice of superstitious old women, but that's clearly not true. I think most of the ones that I looked at were coming from medical books, but we need to take that with a pinch of salt, perhaps, because when I was looking for charms, I wanted to start with the books that were most likely to contain them. Mm-hmm. And so because a lot of charms are for medical purposes, they're often included in recipe collections and that kind of context, sort of household compilations, like useful, practical stuff. So that's where I was finding most of them, and they're very common in those contexts. But they're also very common, like in margins, on fly leaves, in like religious books. They're in all kinds of things. And so very often I was finding them because a catalogue entry would say that there was a charm in books that otherwise I would never have looked at. Like you'd have a book that would be like some classical literature, and then on a flyleaf somebody's written a childbirth charm, or like it's a legal book and in the margin somebody's written like a charm for what happens if your house is on fire. And so those are things that, only because somebody else has noted that they're there would I even be looking at that book. What I'm finding so far is that the charms that are in the margins or on the flyleaves have a kind of slightly different set of purposes. So it's not that you don't find the medical charms in the margins or on the flyleaves, but you find some things in the margins that I don't tend to see in the body text of the manuscript, like charms for putting out fire. And that was one that I noticed because there's all these like narratives about, the church went on fire and we threw a charm over it and then it stopped and wasn't that great. And I had never seen a charm for that purpose. And I have since found two copies or two versions, and both of them are on flyleaves. There's also some of them seem to be written into the margins, like to be cut out and used as written charms.
After that introduction on charms in general, we then moved on to the discussion of 116v. I kind of brought Katherine up to speed on the most likely readings, but a lot of that was covered in the last video already, so I'll mostly be focusing on her replies here and her opinions on the things I was telling her. Let's say this is a charm you find in a regular book and not the most scrutinized piece of parchment in the modern era.
Yeah.
So you find this and you see something that starts with Angiton Oladabas. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I mean, exactly what you have at the top of the slide there, intentional lack of meaning. So one of the things I think is really interesting in the charms is that a lot of them I think are set up to give the impression of a meaning that a human can't understand. So that this is something that's, a divine, angelic, whatever it might be. It's a supernatural language of some sort. And for the human audience, the kind of presence of communication is there, but the content is not comprehensible. And that doesn't matter if the purpose of the charm is to attract supernatural protection. Often I see charms that have words that have no meaning. They're often little kind of jingles, little rhymes that go together. They're quite brief. I see a couple where they start to get worried about words that they don't understand the meaning of, basically. So there's a concern in some of the manuscripts that I looked at that, like, if you don't know what this word is, you don't know that it's not summoning a demon. There's one charm that I love that explicitly comments on that. So it's 3 words that had been used in earlier charms without seeming to cause a problem. And then this one scribe in I think the mid-15th century kind of contextualizes them as like, if you know that these are the names of angels, like that's what people kind of say, but I'm not sure, use at your own risk. So there's clearly a sense that these kind of incomprehensible words are not entirely safe.
These foreign sounding names, they will make words sound like as if they're Greek or Hebrew.
Yeah, or they might have started off as Greek or Hebrew, and by the time they're being written down, they're so corrupt.
Right.
Like I think sometimes they're starting off from a real, like they're a proper language, and then they're just being transmitted so often by people who don't speak that language that they turn into a kind of sound pattern. So yeah, like it might be coming from both directions. The one might be, I want this to sound Greek, and the other one might be like it was Greek and no longer is. One of the ones I find really interesting is, the like word square, Sator Aripo Tenet Opera Rotas, where you can like read it in any direction. So that appears quite commonly in childbirth charms. Okay. And that you would have thought in terms of text, that should be very stable, because if you're thinking of it as a square, everything is like locking all the other parts in. And like that goes wild. I know copies of that where it's like it just sticks in a different word. There was one that's Sato Orat, and then it can't make a square anymore. And so they know the phrase, but they've sort of, in the charm context, not in all contexts, but in the charm context, they've stopped thinking about it as a square. And it seems to me that it must be starting to turn into a kind of, like its power is in its sound.
I read in the editorial notes of some other book where someone transcribed a lot of charms that for meaningless words, they couldn't guarantee a proper transcription because you have to guess so often and you don't know what those 5 minims represent. Is that a problem you've also encountered in your work?
Yeah. I mean, if there's nothing like those minims, that could be anything. And if you suspect that it's not going to be meaningful language, then like how do you know how to cut it up into letters? And for something like this, I would say that typically when I see things with like when it's crosses between the words, like either it's really a sentence that you can read or it's like unknown words kind of thing.
Right.
And from that beginning phrase, I think we're leaning towards the unknown words. So I wouldn't necessarily expect this to be something I could understand.
I'm just gonna move on to the next part, which we do know, a capital N with two pluses, and I assume also must look familiar to you.
Yeah, very. Yeah, so that would be for nomen, like insert name here. Yeah, I see that all over the place. That, or sometimes you see copies where there's been a name inserted. What would be slightly unusual here, I think, is seeing it in between the crosses. Usually it would be in a sentence like, protect me, your servant, nomen, or like heal this patient, nomen. This is unusual in that way, maybe.
Yeah.
Like the other place that the cross appears a lot is in kind of liturgical stuff, to tell you to make the sign of the cross. So possibly this is instructions for performance. It wouldn't even necessarily have to be written. Off the top of my head, I haven't looked back at my database, but I think that when I see this many crosses, typically it's something that you do write down. The most like striking one to me that's full of crosses is like this huge list of the names of God.
Right.
And so it's a cross after every name. And so it's a Christian symbol as well, but it's all of these words that are like they're coming from all different languages and like they have something to do with God. They're not necessarily a direct name, but like something that the Bible uses to describe God or whatever quality of God. There you can see the kind of religious aspect of the charms. And then that same kind of pattern, you see it in things potentially like this, where you have words that are not clearly names of God, but are maybe drawing on some of that expectation of how divine or supernatural names might appear.
Here the transcription is pretty straightforward. Six marix morix vix Abia Maria, which just saying it sounds like, yeah.
No, I think that's pretty common is not the right word, but that's not unusual in the charms that I've seen, that kind of building with the same final syllable. And like, so what's there?
This one with like pax, fax, max.
Rex, pax, nax. Rex and pax are real words, but nax is like with like a third one that also ends in X and it means nothing. And there's another one that's like arex, filiax, sarax. I mean, so the X ending appears in other charms, and that kind of string of words that end in the same way, that's pretty normal.
Generally speaking, when you find a new charm, how likely are we to find an exact sequence of words, for example, that's completely unattested?
It wouldn't shock me. Like all of the stuff that I'm looking at is coming from England, so it's a relatively small area. And like still I'm finding all kinds of variation, even in things that are very obviously like starting from the same place. There's a charm that's got a string of letters in it, and like the surrounding instructions will be the same, and the letters like start off in the same way, and then in the middle it kind of breaks down, and then I think they tend to finish in a similar way as well. But like it seems very clear that people are intending to do a version of the same charm, and that like unknown part that has no meaning, it's hard to remember that. And that's the kind of thing that's going to change as you circulate it and as people use it and remember it differently. We see that even with playground rhymes. I'm surprised that like the rhymes that my niece says are not the same as the ones that I had in the playground when I was a kid. And I think it's probably something like that where, you know, you repeat it enough times and it just changes.
But so what you're saying is exactly in these types of charm or charm parts, we're very likely to see some kind of evolution, some kind of
variation.
The fact that if we Google six marix morix fix and we don't find anything, that's perfectly fine. That
means nothing. If I were trying to find a match, like within my English ones, like let's say I have something like this and I don't know the context and I just want to see if I have similar examples, I'd probably be looking for like, you know, do I have like a 2-syllable word beginning with M and ending in X? And if I found this kind of like, you know, a pattern of those, then I'd be starting to look and see like, are there more relationships between those? I mean, I would try like sticking into my database just like one of these words and see if it came out, but usually it wouldn't. Particularly because medieval spelling is not consistent anyway. So,
you
know.
This last word we haven't really talked about yet, which is not a nonsense word. So again, I have limited experience with charms, but in that limited experience, I've encountered this lady many times.
Yeah. So the two things that I would wonder about with this, and this is all just like thoughts off the top of my head. So the first thing is would Abia Maria be some kind of corruption of Ave Maria? So do we have something that's kind of Christian in there? One is they've added a cross in after that A, the first A of Maria. So is that actually kind of an attempt to separate it out and to be like, no, this isn't Maria, this is Ma, and then Ria. But Maria, Mary is in all kinds of charms. There's quite a few that are like by the milk of the Virgin Mary or whatever. Like, there's one that's like by the breasts of the Virgin, and my students are always shocked when I ask them to translate these like scandalous things to say about her. But they were very okay with breast milk in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Have you ever seen this like superscript cross?
I've definitely seen some where they've like forgotten the cross and they have to put it in afterwards. And so I've seen them do a superscript like that where it seems like they want it to be 2 words and they've copied it, or like they've just left a kind of normal space between the words instead of a space with a cross. So I've seen that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to look at the picture now. Like if that cross were not there, is that enough of a space? I would think that's 2 words. Not really. Like it's a lot smaller than this. But if you ignore the superscript cross, in between crosses, I tend to assume is like 1 word unless you have concrete evidence otherwise. And that is quite a big gap, isn't it? And it's not consistent.
No, it's not consistent at all.
Like it's I think this is just inconsistent hand in general, which I mean adds up to the kind of thing that you put on the blank back page of a manuscript. That's not the place for your finest scribal work usually.
Yeah, exactly, because people are like, oh, this person really couldn't write, but this is not
fine.
It's not gonna be like for a rich patron or something. This is just a quick note. It's perfectly fine that the handwriting is like this.
And it's damaged and it's faded, and like we have more trouble reading it than I'm sure the original writer did. And not just because they're more familiar with the script, but also because they're not, like we're contending with hundreds of years of damage and wear and tear, not necessarily serious damage. But like some of this clearly you can see fading.
Yeah. I mean, there's a hole here, but
I like the hole.
Yeah,
the best part. I love it.
My opinion about this was, okay, here, this clearly belongs in a recipe book. This also, but this is a magic charm. So these are unrelated. But having read your work, I've had to flip that around completely. And I say, well, they're probably related because we find charms in series of instructions that might involve ingredients, right? Yeah.
So you can have a charm that's a part of a wider medical remedy. It would be not uncommon to have something that's like, say this charm and then like have the patient eat whatever thing, or like some sort of medical instruction, herbal medical instruction will come afterwards. Or sometimes like with taking a liquid, if that is milk, I've not seen milk in my examples, but like sometimes you'd like write a text and then you wash it out with a liquid and you drink the liquid as a way of kind of transferring the written words to the patient. So like the charm is not necessarily a standalone thing. It can definitely come along with other types of instruction for sure.
Have you ever seen something like a liver?
Not that I can think of, no. Is it possible that it's the name of a disease, or is it really? No, I mean, I'm more thinking just in terms of like the structure of how a recipe book would normally be laid out. I mean, this is not a recipe book. This is a single charm on a page, but you would usually have a kind of at the top the purpose, or below the purpose. So like it's a short sentence that's right at the top, and then you have a charm underneath. I would usually expect that to be something that's saying like if you have a fever, like when you're bleeding, like a kind of instruction of when you use the charm that's below. I would expect it to be the reason for the charm, but the charm doesn't have to be medical, I guess.
Yeah.
I was saying, I've seen a lot of medical ones, but
we find an example
do other things
of a charm on the last page of a 15th century Catalan manuscript. Someone on the forum found this. And it says it's a way to get rid of bed bugs. You collect the bed bugs in a little box and put them together with a paternoster, so like a rosary, prayer beads, on each corner of your bed while saying Ave Maria. I guess that's not really medical. It's more like domestic.
And I do actually have there's a few that are kind of domestic. And the ones that I see often are like to protect grain and whatever from rats. In that case, the storage room. But like in the four corners, you'll put something. So like that matches your bed bugs, which I don't have a parallel in England. That's really cool. But so it could just be a purpose.
Would you be more inclined to see this as them kind of belonging together or more like separate notes like I used to?
I mean, I've seen it both ways.
Right.
So I've seen manuscripts where you have a charm and then there'll be underneath something which doesn't seem to be related, isn't in any of the other copies of the charm, but just like, you're kind of continuing your like writing session. And I think maybe the fact that it starts a new line, obviously you could start a new line, but is that trying to tell you that we have shifted to a new topic, or is that trying to tell you that the section that you're meant to be saying or writing out has been completed? That's intentional, clearly.
And this spacing here, is that because this is more like a title, or just because they had a lot of space, or is it because it's a separate thing?
Yeah, and it could be any of those.
Yeah.
When it's this kind of like stuff on a flyleaf, yeah, who knows? If you know what they mean, it probably would be obvious. If this was something that was circulating in your community, like if you know that this is the kind of thing that you do, like you don't need somebody to separate the liver and the goat's milk and the charm. If you know that those are three different things or they're the same thing, like if you know the relationship between them, you don't need the kind of hand holding that we do. I'm trying to think if I've got any charms that use meat. Like if we're thinking of it really as the organ, that would be the thing that I would be the most surprised by. Like, I'm sure I don't have a full set of charms. I'm sure, like, I've not memorized all 1100 or whatever are in there. So like I might also not be correct, but certainly meat would be uncommon. I can't think of an example. So, blood, for sure. There's definitely blood in the charms, but like a liver, for me, that would be surprising.
We do find liver and goat liver in cooking recipes. So they did eat it. But then in that case, if we do want to read it as goat liver, then like if your sample is representative of what we're looking at here, then you say it's probably not likely to be an ingredient in the charm itself.
I'm saying I'd be surprised by it. I'm sure I haven't seen the full range of everything that charms can offer, but that would surprise me. It's like if I'm just looking at the page from that layout, my first instinct would be it's a title and then it's a charm.
Yeah.
And usually that title would be what the charm is used for. But like we've said, there's no real reason for them to be associated with one another. So like we don't know that relationship. So it's equally possible that it's just a charm that somebody's written down and there's something else that's at the top of the page. I make no comments about the translation.
I read in several publications on charms that it wouldn't be uncommon to see weird symbols. So not only words that you can read, but that don't have a meaning, but actually symbols that you can't read.
Yeah, I would say they're never common, but they certainly appear. They're like at their height in the 12th, 13th century, and then they seem to slip out of favor a little bit.
But they aren't anything like this, right? They're more like loopy, runic looking.
Yeah, no, nothing like that. If I kind of close my eyes and then open them again on this page, I think I can read the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then I look closer and like, no, wait, I can't. And these ones, like, they stand out as unusual immediately. Sometimes they're like completely set out. So you'll have a legible text, like, write this on a lead plate or whatever. And then they'll have the characters underneath. And then you'll kind of start again with legible text. So they're very clearly set off from the rest. Sometimes they're kind of embedded. So you might have like a series of characters and like some of them maybe you can read and some of them are illegible symbols, like 3 letters of the alphabet that are legible and then like a Greek letter and then a weird symbol and then, but kind of with a point in between them, like they're
or a cross.
Yeah, something that's kind of separating them out as individual units. The way that when you look at this, you immediately notice the crosses between the words. The kinds of symbols that I'm usually seeing in the charms are it's more like that kind of thing, something that immediately visually jumps off the page and you're like, oh, this is not what I'm used to looking at, and this is not visually doing that in the same way. Like it's not like it's trying to look weird. It just does. Sometimes there are things where you don't want everyone to understand, but some people it's okay. There's one that I know where you have the words and they're like unknown words but legible. And then the charm says like, oh, but you should write them in Greek letters because if the common people see them, they'll stop working. Like, you have enough education that you can look at these without doing harm, but like all these dumb people that you're treating. And one of the manuscripts gives you like, here's how you write them in Greek. So there is a kind of deliberate ciphering maybe. And there it's telling you to put them into Greek letters. The Greek's not correct entirely, but Yeah, like that sense that you might translate something into another version and it will still work, but the like visual identity of it is very different. And the access that your patient would have is very different. There seems to be more concern about secrecy later, and I wonder if it's partly to do with the fact that more people are able to write, and so more people are able to produce the charm on their own. And so if you want to be paid for providing this kind of medical service, then like maybe it's good to say that like other people can't see it.
In the Voynich context, that's an interesting thought, that there might be more of an idea that certain knowledge and certain practices should be protected from these upcoming masses who can also read and write now. But yeah, I still find it interesting that charms draw in the unknown, the ununderstood, the foreign, the orientalizing even sometimes, like pseudo-Kufic, pseudo-Hebrew.
One theory for the origin of those like illegible characters that we were talking about is that they're very old and they're all across Europe. And one theory is that it starts with people kind of wanting to use hieroglyphics and not being able to write them. And so you get this kind of series of like magical characters that stand in for this idea that like one sign has one meaning. That's a kind of useful magical idea, even if it's not correct and even if that's nothing to do with the hieroglyphs. But there's that kind of desire for something which is powerful but illegible, but contains meaning, but not for you. Are they words that appear elsewhere in the manuscript? But like they seem to be units that appear elsewhere.
When Katherine asked this question in the interview, I didn't really do it justice, so I'll provide a more complete answer now. These two words do, in fact, appear elsewhere in the manuscript, and they do so in an interesting way. The second word is frequent, with over 100 attestations in many different folios. But this first word is less common, maybe occurring about a dozen times in the manuscript. Remarkably though, this exact sequence is found on one page, folio 104R. These last pages of the manuscript are traditionally called the recipes section because of their superficial resemblance to the common medieval format of itemized paragraphs, each one a new recipe or treatment. Now, admittedly, this section of the manuscript is also the one with the most text, so I guess it has a statistical advantage. But it's still interesting to find these two words in a sequence here, both in the context of apparent recipes. Okay, so where does this leave us? After having talked to all these scholars, I still haven't cracked the mystery of Folio 116v, but I do feel like I understand it a bit better now. Not everything about it is as abnormal as it looks at first glance. Charms with crosses are extremely common in medieval texts all over Europe and throughout centuries. To find one on the last page of a manuscript is completely normal. Mixing instructions and recipes with charms is normal and even expected. Most charms are found in medicinal contexts, specifically in these itemized lists of remedies. The fact that the last section of the Voynich Manuscript, of which folio 116 is the last page, presents itself as such a recipe collection may be relevant. Mixing languages in this context is normal and even expected. Recipes and instructions are in the vernacular because they're basic things that need to be understood well, but charms don't need to be understood at all. They draw in mysterious words and symbols and flirt with the foreign. Many of you commented to the first video how it reminded you of Greek in several ways, and I think those observations are correct. For me, it's especially this first word, anchiton, in the charm, which apparently combines the Greek prefix an with the Greek word chiton, but that's not even the point, because such words in charms don't need to be understood, just like nobody is thinking about the etymology of abracadabra while pulling a rabbit out of a hat. These words get their power from their sound and flair, not their meaning. What is not normal, though, is that we are struggling so much with the German parts. Like I said, the vernacular surrounding the charm proper is always direct and to the point. Take this, do this, write this, and then do that. It needs to be because understanding the steps is important both in medicine and cooking. I've gone through a lot of these now, and while anything goes in the charm, the instructions are always clear. So that's very weird. Additionally, I think Katherine made a good point that if the 4 lines are connected, we would expect the top line to be a title or description of what the thing is for. I'll anticipate some comments here by adding that pox had nothing to do with the disease in 15th century German. This is most likely a bug's liver. It's possible that this text is simply incomplete, as suggested by Don Schemer. Or maybe it's presented in such an abbreviated way that we, 600 years later, living in a different culture and linguistic reality, just can't grasp its meaning anymore. Or maybe the first line isn't related and the charm is written without mentioning what it's for. Or maybe this is weird and creepy Voynich Manuscript stuff, after all. Meanwhile, we are creeping towards 10,000 subscribers with this channel, which is something I'd never have expected from these deep dives into an otherwise over-sensationalized subject. Thank you guys so much for subscribing, for understanding my goals with this content, and for your incredibly insightful and encouraging comments. I really appreciate it. One of the dominant surviving ideas of how we could possibly find any meaning in Voynich is that maybe in the labels with plant parts there or stars, that those might have meaning. And so then this would certainly qualify as part of that category of words that are set aside to kind of stand out.
Standing out alongside a whole bunch of words that we don't think has meaning. So, I mean, other than the synonym, but
we translate
everything above.
Manuscript. It's all nonsense.
Yay! Just one giant charm.
Maybe that's a title for my video. Is the Voynich Manuscript one giant charm?
Probably not. End of video.